I was watching the live feed from Nara yesterday, and for a second you could almost forget these were two of the most powerful people in East Asia. There was Prime Minister Takaichi and President Lee, sleeves rolled up, sweating under the stage lights, absolutely hammering away at a synchronized K-pop drum routine. On social media, the clips went viral instantly. People were calling it a heartwarming thaw, a breakthrough in drumstick diplomacy that finally put decades of bitterness to rest. You look at their faces, the smiles, the shared rhythm, and you think, finally, they're just two human beings finding common ground. But then I started looking closer at the rhythm itself. It wasn't the loose, messy energy of a jam session. It was something else. Every strike of the drum, every glance between them was terrifyingly perfect. It didn't feel like art. It felt like a software update. While the world saw a cultural gesture, what I saw was something far colder. A meticulously engineered performance by the world's two most successful managerial societies. Think about it. Why K-pop? Why now? If you think this was about friendship, you're missing the real story. This wasn't a spontaneous display of emotion. It was a high-pressure valve being opened. It was a demonstration of how these two nations have learned to weaponize their own internal anxieties, turning social pressure into an industrial-scale export. Those drums weren't playing a song of peace. They were playing the rhythm of a shared bureaucratic survival strategy. And once you see the industrial logic behind that performance, the heartwarming image of two world leaders drumming together starts to look a lot more like a calculated, cold-blooded masterpiece of statecraft.
It's a jarring contrast, isn't it? I mean, you have this vibrant, colorful, loud spectacle on the surface, and underneath, you're suggesting there is this cold, grinding machinery.
Exactly, and I think that contrast is what makes it so interesting.
But I think you are spot on. If we stop looking at the smiles for a moment and actually look at the data, the demographic charts, the trade balances, the internal polling, that drum performance starts to look less like a party and more like a desperate structural reinforcement.
Desperate is a strong word. I mean, if these are two of the most advanced economies on the planet. They aren't exactly failing states. But you're saying that this event, this NARA summit, wasn't just a photo op.
Not even close. It was a survival strategy. We have to, strip away the entertainment value for a minute.
Okay.
We are looking at two nations, Japan and South Korea, that are facing a convergence of crises that are almost impossible to overstate. We call them managerial societies because their primary mode of governance isn't really about ideological revolution anymore. It's about managing a very specific, very dangerous decline.
A decline? What kind of decline are we talking about?
Well, for starters, they're dealing with hyper-aging populations. This is a demographic cliff that no modern society has ever faced on this scale. Then you have diplomatic stalemates that have been frozen for 80 years, these historical wounds that never seem to heal.
Right.
And on top of that, you have this intense internal social pressure that is causing their young people to, in some cases, opt out of society entirely. Burnout, competition, it's extreme.
So the drumming is
what?
A distraction from all that.
Yeah.
A way to get everyone to look at the shiny object.
It's not just a distraction, it's a mechanism. It's much more sophisticated than that. It is a way to demonstrate vitality to the world when your internal demographics screen decline.
Okay, performative vitality, I get that.
It is a way to perform diplomacy when your history books scream hostility. And maybe most importantly, it is a way to enforce social cohesion when your economy is screaming inequality.
Okay, that is a massive claim. I mean, that's a huge framework you just laid out. We need to break that down because I don't want to just throw around buzzwords like managerial society without showing the listener exactly how the gears turn.
No, absolutely. We need to get into the weeds.
And we can. We've got a massive stack of sources here. Everything from interviews with lighting technicians to dense papers on Confucian ethics and diplomatic history. So for today's deep dive, let's look at this event through three specific lenses. How does that sound?
Perfect. What are they?
First, we're going to look at the money, what we're calling the industrial engine, economic survival. Then we'll get into the politics, the diplomatic ritual, and finally we'll look at the people, the social control aspect.
Which is the logical hierarchy of a state, really. You need an economy to fund the government, you need diplomacy to keep the borders safe, and you need social control to stop the population from revolting. It all connects.
It all connects. So let's start with the money, the industrial engine. And I want to get away from the high-level economics for a second, just zoom in on the ground level. I was reading through the background interviews for the NARA summit, and there was this one account that really stuck with me. It's about a man named Sato-san.
Ah, the lighting technician, right.
Right. Sato-san is a 68-year-old technician living in Tokyo. Now, just picture this guy for a second. He's been working in this industry since the bubble era, in the 80s. He's seen it all.
So he's from the generation that saw Japan at its economic peak. The Japan is #1 era.
Precisely. And now he's standing in the middle of this high-tech arena in Nara, rigging these massive neon displays. His knees are aching because he's been on his feet for 40 years. He's surrounded by technology that didn't exist when he started, and he's setting the stage for these K-pop and J-pop idols who are, barely out of their teens.
And he is representative of a massive, and I mean massive, demographic in Japan, the generation that built the country and is now facing retirement in an uncertain economy.
Exactly. But here's the kicker. This is the part that got me. He's looking at these kids, these idols, and he isn't thinking, wow, what great music or what talented performers.
No.
He's thinking about his pension. He explicitly mentions that he views the industrialization of culture as the only thing keeping his pension fund solvent. He knows that Japan doesn't dominate consumer electronics the way it used to. He knows the population is shrinking.
He sees the writing on the wall.
He sees it every day. So he looks at these performers and sees them not as artists, but as economic gears. If they don't sell this cool image to the world, if they don't generate export revenue, the economic weight of his generation, the elderly, is going to crush the ground he's standing on.
That is a profound observation for a lighting technician. But he's absolutely right. What Sato-san is witnessing, perhaps without knowing the academic term for it, is the evolution of the developmental state.
We hear that term a lot in Asian economics, the developmental state. But usually, we're talking about steel mills in the 1960s or car factories in the 70s. How does that possibly apply to a K-pop concert in 2026?
Well, let's just quickly define the developmental state first, so we're all on the same page. In the Western model, ideally, the government sets the rules and the free market decides what to build. If the market wants to build toaster ovens, you build toaster ovens. If it wants to build complex financial derivatives, you build derivatives.
The government is a referee, not a player.
Right. But in the East Asian model, specifically Japan post-war and Korea, under Park Chung-hee, the state takes a much more active interventionist role. They say, we need to rebuild the nation, so we're going to prioritize shipbuilding, or steel, or cars.
And they back it up. They don't just say it.
They put their thumb on the scale, heavily. They funnel low-interest loans, tax breaks, and protectionist policies to specific sectors to ensure they succeed. They basically pick winners.
Right. This is how we got the industrial giants. Mitsubishi, Toyota, Hyundai, Samsung.
Yeah.
These companies didn't just pop up out of nowhere.
Exactly. They were cultivated. But fast forward to the 1990s and 2000s, the catch-up phase is over. Manufacturing is moving to China or Southeast Asia because labor is cheaper there.
And the population is starting to age.
The population is starting to age. The state needs a new engine, a new growth sector. They can't just build more ships or more cars. So they pivot. They decide to apply that same heavy industry logic to something intangible, culture.
So they treat a pop song the same way they treat a semiconductor.
Yeah.
As a strategic national asset.
Effectively, yes. And there is a famous turning point mentioned in our sources, often called the Sonata effect.
The Sonata effect. I saw that in the notes, and I have to ask, I assume we're talking about the car, the Hyundai Sonata.
We are. This is almost a mythological moment in South Korean policy circles, but it's based on a real event. In 1994, a government advisory board presented a report to the president. They had crunched the numbers on the Hollywood movie Jurassic Park.
The dinosaur movie from 1993.
The dinosaur movie. They calculated that the total revenue generated by Jurassic Park, that's tickets, merchandise, licensing, everything, was equivalent to the profit from exporting 1.5 million Hyundai Sonatas.
Hold on. One movie equals 1.5 million cars. That sounds like, I don't know, bureaucratic fuzzy math. Did The Economist actually buy that, or was it just a flashy slide for a presentation?
It was likely a bit of both. You know how these reports can be, but the impact was real. You have to understand the mindset of a Korean bureaucrat in 1994. Their entire worldview was built on stuff. Steel, rubber, glass, semiconductors, hard assets.
Tangible goods, things you can load onto a container ship.
Precisely. The idea that a single piece of intellectual property could generate that much value without needing a massive factory, without importing raw materials, without pollution. It was a revelation. They called it the chimneyless industry.
Chimneyless industry? That's evocative. That must have sounded like the future.
It changed everything. Before that moment, the government's role in culture was mostly censorship. You know, stopping people from singing protest songs or women from wearing miniskirts. It was prohibitive.
So it was about control, not growth.
Yes. After the Sonata effect, the paradigm shifted from regulation to promotion. They realized we need to make our own Jurassic Parks. The mission became clear.
So how did they actually do it? Because you can't just pass a law that says, be creative. That's not how art works. Or is it?
No, but you can build the infrastructure for creativity. And this is where the difference between Japan and Korea gets really interesting and where our sources diverge a bit. Japan tried to do this with the Cool Japan policy.
Cool Japan, right. I remember seeing that plastered everywhere a few years ago. It was on, like, airport posters and everything.
You did. And it's still around. But the critique in our source material is that Cool Japan was largely an inbound strategy.
Inbound? What do you mean?
They wanted to use anime and sushi and fashion to get people to visit Japan and buy Japanese goods. It was about attracting tourism and consumption. They set up the Cool Japan Fund, which was a government-backed investment vehicle, but, and this is the key detail, it was run by bureaucrats.
Oh, no, I can see where this is going. A bunch of 60-year-old guys in suits in Kasumigaseki trying to decide what's cool for teenagers in Paris or Los Angeles.
Precisely. And the fund has notoriously underperformed. The sources are pretty clear on this. They invested in things that felt safe or traditional, often missing the actual trends. It was a very top-down approach that struggled to connect with the market. It was a bit clumsy.
It sounds like a parent trying to use teenage slang. It just doesn't land.
That's a great way to put it. Now, Korea took a different path, a much more aggressive path. They leveraged the K-balls.
The chaebols. For listeners who don't follow Korean economics, those are the massive family-run conglomerates, right? Samsung, LG, Hyundai, CJ. They're into everything.
Correct. These companies control a massive percentage of the Korean GDP. In the late 90s, after the Asian financial crisis, the government essentially tapped them on the shoulder and said, we need you to develop the cultural sector. This is a national priority.
And they just did it. Just because the government asked.
Well, the relationship between the K-balls and the state is complex. It's symbiotic, but yes, they got on board. And what's fascinating is that companies like Samsung and CJ actually entered the film and music markets.
Wait, Samsung making movies? The same company that makes my phone and my washing machine.
Samsung Entertainment was a real thing, and they didn't mess around. They treated film production with the same systematic rigor they applied to microchips. They brought in management systems from Hollywood, they rationalized the distribution networks, they standardized the scripts.
So they industrialized the creative process itself.
They tried. Eventually, Samsung pulled back after a few years, but the infrastructure they built, the industrial logic, remained. CJ Group took the baton and ran with it. And that's why when you watch a K-pop video today, or a movie like Parasite, it doesn't feel like a scrappy indie project.
No, it's incredibly polished. It feels engineered.
Because it is engineered, it's the result of 30 years of deliberate industrial policy, a partnership between the state and big capital.
So bring this all back to Sato-san, our lighting tech. When he says in the source that he's using the fire of youth to warm an aging house, he's not being poetic.
He's not being poetic. He's describing the macroeconomic reality of his country. Japan and Korea are hyper-aging. Their domestic markets are shrinking. They have fewer workers to pay taxes to support a growing elderly population.
The math just doesn't work long-term.
The math is terrifying. So the only way to survive is to export. And if you can't compete on cheap labor for manufacturing anymore, you have to compete on high-value cultural exports.
So the synchronization we saw on stage in Nor Prime Minister Takaichi and President Lee drumming in perfect time, that's a signal. It's more than just a performance.
It's a signal of economic vitality. It says to the world, we are still dynamic, we are still relevant, we can produce things you want to buy. And it says to their own anxious populations, the system still works. We can still produce world-class products. It is a technocratic mechanism to offset the fear of decline.
That is a heavy start, but it really sets the stakes. It's not just entertainment. It's the GDP. It's Sato-san's pension. It's national survival.
It is.
Now, I want to pivot to our second lens. We've talked about the money. Now, let's talk about the handshake, the politics, the performance of it all. We're calling this the ritual of order.
This is where things get even more theatrical, in a way, even more performative.
Right. And to set the scene here, we have another perspective from the ground, another one of these, personal accounts that just cuts through the noise. I was reading a post on a diplomatic forum from a junior staffer named Ji-won. She was part of the South Korean protocol team in Nara.
Protocol teams are the unsung heroes, or perhaps the stage managers of these events. They script everything.
She described the atmosphere in the hall as completely detached from reality. She said outside there were protesters,
Yeah.
nationalists from both sides screaming about history, about territory, about the past, just raw, angry emotion.
The usual scene at these summits, unfortunately.
But inside, silence. She described the heavy, traditional doors of the hall closing, muffling the noise. And then she watched the handshake between Takeichi and Lee. She wrote that it wasn't the impulsive, ego-driven grip of a Western politician trying to dominate the room.
No power plays, no pulling the other person off balance.
None of that. It was what she called post-legal protocol.
Post-legal protocol. That is a very interesting phrase. What does she mean by that?
She meant that every micro-movement, the angle of the bow, the duration of the grip, the number of steps, was choreographed months in advance. It was beyond negotiation. It was settled fact. She said the silence inside the hall wasn't peace. It was a tacit understanding that they were going to ignore the noise outside to build a bureaucratic shell, a safe space for elites. She calls it the Nara Compact. The idea that while the public screams about history, the elites operate on a different frequency, a different set of rules.
G1 is identifying something that goes back centuries in East Asian diplomacy. To understand this Nara Compact, we need to look at a concept from the Adachi paper in our source stack. As-if engagement.
As-if engagement. I stumbled over this in the notes. It sounds like lying. It sounds dishonest.
It's not lying exactly, it's ritual. There's a very important distinction. Lying is trying to deceive someone into believing a falsehood. As-if engagement is a shared performance where both sides know it's a performance, but they do it anyway because the performance itself creates a certain kind of reality.
Give me a real-world analogy, because performance creating reality sounds a bit abstract for a political summit.
Okay, think about a tense family reunion, a holiday dinner. You have an uncle you absolutely cannot stand. You disagree with his politics, his lifestyle, everything about him.
I think we all have that uncle.
Right, but for the sake of your grandmother, for the harmony of the event, when you sit down at the dinner table, you pass him the potatoes, you smile, you ask about his job, you act as if you are a harmonious family.
Okay, so I'm not lying to him. He knows I don't like him, and I know he doesn't like me. But we are performing family to keep the dinner from turning into a brawl. The performance maintains the peace.
Exactly. The ritual is the solution. And in the context of East Asian history, this was the tribute system. For centuries, China, Japan, and Korea had to coexist. They had very different, often conflicting worldviews. China saw itself as the middle kingdom, the center of the universe.
And Japan wasn't having that.
Japan often refused to accept that subordinate role. Korea had its own complex position, navigating between the two. If they had insisted on authentic dialogue, if they had insisted on saying exactly what they really thought of each other, they would have been at war constantly.
So instead, they exchanged gifts, they bowed, they performed the rituals.
They enacted a known fiction. Everyone knew the Emperor of Japan didn't really see the Chinese emperor as his superior, but his envoys performed the rituals anyway. Why? Because it allowed trade to flow. It allowed borders to remain stable. It was a managerial solution to an intractable ideological problem.
So apply that to Nara. Takeichi and Lee drumming together. They aren't friends. This isn't a genuine breakthrough in their personal relationship.
The sources suggest they likely have very little personal affinity. Their nations have deep, unresolved historical grievances, colonialism, forced labor, territorial disputes. These aren't small things you can just agree to disagree on. But the as-if framework allows them to bypass that. They are performing as if they are aligned, as if they are friends. Why? To maintain managerial stability in the face of larger threats, like a rising China or global economic instability.
This connects to another really interesting point in the research, the contrast between this approach and what we typically see in the West. The Feng and Etienne paper we looked at discusses Confucian governance versus Western populism.
This is crucial to understanding the aesthetics of the event, why it looked the way it did.
Explain that.
In the West, specifically in the Enlightenment tradition, we tend to view politics as rule by the people.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be messy. It's supposed to be a debate. We want our leaders to be authentic. If a Western leader goes off script or gets angry or plays a messy, passionate guitar solo, we often see that as a sign of honesty, of humanity.
Right. We want to see the human behind the suit. We want to feel like we can relate to them.
But in the Confucian model, which still deeply influences the bureaucratic aesthetic of Japan and Korea, even if they are democracies, the ideal is rule for the people. It is a paternalistic meritocracy. The leader isn't supposed to be your buddy. They're supposed to be a virtuous authority, a wise steward.
So being messy isn't authentic. It's just incompetent. It shows a lack of discipline.
Precisely. In this worldview, the precision of that drum performance, the fact that they hit the skins at the exact same millisecond, is a demonstration of competence. It signals discipline. It signals that the hands on the steering wheel of the state are steady. It is a direct, if unspoken, rejection of the chaotic volatility we so often see in Western politics these days.
So the perfection is the message.
The perfection is the entire message.
Wow. That puts the choice of Nara as a location in a whole new light. Nara is an ancient capital. It's not Tokyo. It's not Seoul. It's not a modern financial hub. It's a place steeped in history.
It's the Nara Compact in physical form. By meeting in Nara, they are anchoring themselves in a pre-modern history. They are reaching back to a time of shared Buddhism, shared Confucian texts, shared court music, a time before the traumas of the 20th century.
They are deliberately bypassing the last 100 years of conflict.
They're trying to. It's like a social software update for the elite class. They are attempting to uninstall the Nationalism 1.0 software that causes all the protests outside and installing Bureaucratic Survival 2026.
It prioritizes administrative continuity over emotional resolution. That's a great phrase from the source material.
It is. They aren't trying to fix the past. They're trying to encase it in a concrete shell so they can build the future on top of it without the whole structure shaking apart.
But that brings us back to Jiwon, the staffer. She's inside the hall. She sees the as-if ritual working perfectly. But she knows the protesters are just outside those heavy doors. The ritual works for the elites, but does it work for the people? Does the known fiction actually satisfy the guy on the street?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that leads us directly to your third lens. Because all of this, the economic pressure, the diplomatic acting, it all pushes down onto the individual citizen. What does it feel like to live in that system?
Right. The social valve. This is the part of the deep dive where I think we really need to look at the psychological toll of living in these managerial societies. And again, we have a story, a personal perspective about a young man named Min-jun.
The salaryman in Seoul.
Yeah. Min-jun works in one of those gleaming glass towers in Gangnam. He's typical of his generation, highly educated, working 14 hours a day, barely sleeping. The sources describe him squeezing into a midnight subway car, feeling like a pressurized steam pipe.
The Hell Joseon phenomena, that's the term young Koreans use.
Exactly. Young Koreans calling their own society hell. The competition is that fierce. And Min-jun is on this train, exhausted, head against the window, and he pulls out his phone. He watches the live stream of the Nara summit. He watches Takaichi and Lee drumming.
And what's his reaction? Is he angry? Cynical?
That's the complex part. For a moment, he feels better.
Better how? He knows this won't change his life.
He knows. He doesn't think the summit will lower his rent. He doesn't think it will reduce his work hours. But the spectacle, the sheer perfect high production value of it, gives him a moment of release. The script calls it a pressure relief valve. He consumes this hyper-standardized comfort.
This is a critical sociological function of modern pop culture, especially state-backed pop culture. We talked earlier about that phrase from the new source text, weaponizing anxiety.
Yeah, that phrase scares me a little, weaponizing anxiety. What does that mean in practice? It sounds dystopian.
Well, think about where these cultural products come from. Think about the training that goes into K-pop, or the intensity of the Japanese education system that produces certain kinds of art. It is born from a culture of extreme perfectionism and unbelievable pressure.
Right. The stories about the K-pop training camps are legendary.
To become an idol, you train for years, you diet obsessively, you rehearse until you bleed. You are subjected to total surveillance and total discipline. It's a crucible.
It's the same pressure Min-jun feels at his corporate job, just turned up to 11 and put on a global stage.
Precisely. It is the sublimation of social pressure. When Min-jun watches that perfect synchronized performance, he's seeing his own struggle for perfection reflected back to him, but it's beautiful, it's successful, it's world-conquering.
So it validates his own suffering in a weird way?
It channels it. The state is essentially taking the internal friction of the society, the competition, the anxiety, the stress, and packaging it into a polished, exportable product.
So instead of Min-jun exploding with rage or protesting or quitting his job and dropping out,
he consumes the spectacle. He feels a sense of social cohesion. He feels part of a shared rhythm, even if it's just for a few minutes on the subway. And then he goes back to work the next day and endures the pressure cooker for another 14 hours.
it's a mechanism for stability, a psychological one.
And this ties back to the role of government we discussed in the as-if section. In a promotional state, that Confucian model. The government has a mandate to maintain harmony. Discord is dangerous. Information that upsets the social order is dangerous.
So they curate the vibe. They provide a national narrative.
They curate the reality. The drumstick diplomacy is a state-sanctioned spectacle designed to create a sense of unity in a society that is, in reality, fracturing under the stress of hyper-competition and urbanization.
It's performance without belief applied domestically. That's a powerful idea.
Yes. Min-jin doesn't have to believe the leaders are saints or that all our historical problems are solved. He just needs the comfort of the spectacle to keep functioning within the high-stress environment.
It reminds me of a phrase I jotted down from one of the critiques, industrialized sincerity.
Yes, that's a good one.
We usually think of sincerity as something raw, something human, spontaneous. But here, the smiles on Takeichi and Lee's faces, they are manufactured. They are produced with the same rigor as a Samsung screen or a Toyota car.
And the scary part is, it works.
But, and this is a dark part, just because they are manufactured doesn't mean they aren't effective. The feeling of comfort Min-jin gets is real, even if the source of it is synthetic.
That is the crux of the managerial society. Effectiveness is the only metric that matters. Does it keep the pension fund solvent? Yes. Does it keep the borders quiet? Yes. Does it keep the workforce productive and prevent social unrest? Yes. If the answer to these questions is yes, then the industrial logic justifies itself, regardless of authenticity.
It's almost efficient to a fault. It treats the human soul, human emotion, as just another input in the system that needs to be managed and optimized.
In a way, yes, but we also have to ask ourselves, what is the alternative? These nations are facing genuine existential threats. If they didn't have these mechanisms, if they didn't have the developmental state economics or the as-if diplomacy or the social pressure valves, would they collapse? Would we see chaos?
That's a fair question. Maybe the cold-blooded masterpiece is better than the hot-blooded mess of social breakdown.
That is certainly what the elites in Nara are betting on. That a predictable, managed system, even a cold one, is preferable to the alternative.
So let's try to pull this all together. We've covered a lot of ground today, looked at this from three very different angles. We started with the industrial engine.
With Sato-san and his pension.
We saw Sato-san rigging the lights, realizing that the fire of youth in these pop idols is being used to keep the economic house of an aging nation warm. We saw how the state strategically shifted from steel to culture, turning the Sonata effect into a national survival strategy.
The shift from manufacturing goods to manufacturing influence, a chimneyless industry for a post-industrial age.
Then we looked at the ritual of order. We saw the junior diplomat, Jiwan, watching the handshake, understanding that the silence in the hall was a constructed reality, a bureaucratic shell. We learned about as-if engagement, the ancient art of performing agreement to maintain stability. We saw how the Nara Compact bypasses the messy 20th century to anchor itself in a safer, older, shared history.
Prioritizing the bureaucrat over the populist. Competence over authenticity.
And finally, we looked at the social valve. We sat with Min-jin on that midnight subway. We saw how the state weaponizes anxiety, turning the crushing pressure of modern life into a polished, exportable spectacle that in turn, keeps the domestic population in line.
Right.
We saw how industrialized sincerity acts as the psychological glue holding a fracturing society together.
It creates a comprehensive, if somewhat chilling, picture of a new kind of statecraft. It's not about grand ideologies anymore. It's not left versus right. It's about maintenance. It's about systems management. It's about survival.
It really changes how I see that drum performance. When I first saw it, like everyone else, I thought, oh, that's cute. That's a nice moment. Now, after this deep dive, I see it as a fortress.
A fortress is exactly what it is. It's a defense mechanism.
When you see that perfect synchronization on stage, the drums hitting at the exact same millisecond, you aren't seeing friendship. You are seeing a defensive architecture. It's a fortress built of pop culture and protocol, designed to protect these nations from the volatility of the outside world and, more importantly, the anxieties from within. It is a heartwarming image, sure.
On the surface.
But underneath, it is a cold, calculated masterpiece of survival.
And perhaps, in a world that feels increasingly chaotic and unpredictable, there is a certain seduction to that cold, calculated order. It's not romantic, but it works. And maybe for now, that's enough.
That is the thought I'm going to be left with. We say we want our leaders to be human, to be authentic, but maybe, just maybe, what we actually need them to be is machines.
A provocative thought to end on.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the rhythm of bureaucracy.
My pleasure.
And to you, listening. Next time you see a viral clip of a politician doing something unexpected and charming, ask yourself, what is the industrial logic behind this smile? We'll see you next time.